The Greek camp stretched along the shore like a wound upon the earth, the long black ships drawn up in ranks that spoke of endless striving. Warriors moved between the tents with the heavy tread of men who had fought too long and gained too little. The air itself seemed to press down, thick with the salt of the sea and the sharper bite of unspoken grievance. Agamemnon stood before the council, his face set like carved stone, and the words that left his mouth carried the weight of a king who would not bend. He spoke of the priest's daughter and the god's wrath that followed, yet his eyes already sought another prize. Briseis had been given to Achilles after the last raid, a token of valor earned in blood. Now Agamemnon claimed her as his due, the compensation he refused to accept from any lesser hand. The assembly fell silent. Spears leaned against shields. No man moved. Achilles rose slowly. His shoulders filled the space between the fires, and the light caught the bronze of his armor as though the metal itself burned. He did not shout at first. His voice came low, each word measured like the draw of a bowstring. "You would strip from me the honor I won with my own spear while you sit behind your walls and count the spoils. Is this the reward of the best among you?" The silence deepened. Even the waves seemed to pause their ceaseless rush against the sand. Agamemnon's reply cut through that stillness like a blade. He would take the girl that very hour, he declared, so that Achilles might learn who held power in the host. The king's men stepped forward, and the moment stretched taut. Achilles' hand went to the hilt at his side, yet he did not draw. Instead, his gaze locked on Agamemnon's, and in that look passed the breaking of alliances long held. The breath of every watcher shortened. Briseis was led away between the tents. She did not struggle. Her eyes remained fixed on the ground as though the earth might open and spare her the sight. Achilles watched her go without another word. When the flap of his shelter fell closed behind the departing figures, something inside him shifted and settled into cold resolve. He turned from the council fire and walked back to his own ships, the myrmidons parting before him like reeds before a storm. Inside his tent the hero sat alone. The great shield leaned against the central pole, its surface still marked by the dust of recent battle. Achilles spoke to no one. His rage did not flare outward in cries or curses. It sank inward, deep and immovable, until it became a vow. He would not fight again for Agamemnon's cause. The war could rage without him. Let the Greeks feel the absence of their strongest arm. Far across the camp, the king's laughter rose, sharp and uneasy, but it died quickly. The men returned to their duties with lowered eyes and careful steps. No songs were sung that night. Only the creak of ropes against the hulls and the distant murmur of the sea filled the dark. Achilles remained apart, his mind already reaching toward the gods who might yet answer the wound dealt to his honor. The quarrel had begun, and with it the long silence of the greatest warrior would shape the days to come. The silence of the Greek camp lingered into the grey dawn, where men stirred without the usual clamor of shields and boasts. Achilles had withdrawn, his tent a sealed shadow against the sea, and the absence pressed like a weight upon every heart. Hector felt the shift in the air as he roused his Trojans. He stood at the forefront of their lines, spear in hand, his voice cutting through the morning mist with the force of command. The Greeks had grown careless in their pride, relying on one man's wrath to hold the line. Now that wrath slept, and the field lay open. The charge began with a thunder of feet against earth. Hector led from the front, his shield raised high as arrows hissed overhead. Trojans surged beside him, their cries rising in unison, while the enemy ranks wavered at the sight of an unbroken advance. Spears clashed in the first clash, and men fell with the wet sound of iron meeting flesh. The Greeks fought hard, yet their formation buckled under the relentless press. Hector pressed deeper, cutting through a knot of defenders who sought to rally around their fallen. His brother Paris fought nearby, arrows flying true from the flank, but it was Hector's presence that steadied the line. Each step forward carried the weight of Troy's survival, the memory of lost kin fueling every strike. The emotional stakes burned hot in his chest, for failure here meant the end of their walls and the scattering of their people. The Greeks yielded ground by inches at first, then by yards. Their leaders shouted orders that went unheeded amid the chaos, voices cracking with the strain of holding what could no longer be held. Hector drove his spear through one man's shield and into the chest beyond, the impact jarring up his arm as the body slumped. Around him, Trojans roared their triumph, the sound swelling like a wave that threatened to drown the shore. A brief lull fell over the center as both sides drew breath, the air thick with dust and the iron tang of blood. Hector's gaze swept the field, noting the Greek ships gleaming in the distance. They must reach those hulls before night fell again. He raised his voice once more, urging his men onward with words that carried the promise of glory and the threat of ruin. The Trojans answered with renewed vigor, shields locking as they advanced in tight formation. The push intensified near the camp's edge, where Greek tents stood vulnerable. Warriors broke and ran, their retreat turning into a desperate scramble toward the beached vessels. Hector pursued without mercy, his sword flashing in arcs that felled stragglers and broke what remained of their courage. Emotional stakes rose with every fallen comrade, for the Trojans knew this victory could turn the war if they seized it fully. One Greek captain tried to stem the tide, planting his standard in the sand and calling for a stand. Hector met him in single combat, the clash of bronze ringing sharp and final. The man died with a gasp, his eyes wide in the moment before the light left them. Hector stepped over the body, the standard toppling as his forces swept past. The ships drew nearer now, their masts rising like a forest against the horizon. Greeks clambered aboard in disorder, some casting off lines in haste while others fought to protect the loading of supplies. Hector's charge reached the water's edge, driving the last defenders into the surf. Waves lapped at ankles and knees as the battle spilled into the shallows, the foam turning pink with the fallen. Tense silence followed the final rout, broken only by the heavy breathing of victors and the distant cries of the wounded. Hector stood amid the wreckage of the Greek line, his armor streaked and his spear lowered at last. The Trojans had driven their enemies to the very brink of the sea, and for this day at least, the balance of the war had shifted. The sea lapped against the broken hulls, and the foam turned pink with the fallen, yet Hector remained unmoved amid the Greek dead, his spear tip resting on the sand, as if the day's work were done. From the ridge above the camp, Patroclus watched the last of the Myrmidons fall back, their shields splintered and their voices hoarse with defeat. The armor of Achilles lay in the tent behind him, polished and waiting, its bronze plates catching the late sun like a second sun itself. He stepped inside alone. The weight of the decision settled on his shoulders before the metal did. One by one he lifted the greaves, the breastplate, the great helm crested with horsehair that Achilles had worn into every battle until now. The straps bit into his skin as he fastened them, the cuirass pressed against his ribs with a cold authority that was not his own. When he lifted the shield, its inner rim struck his forearm, and the sound rang out like a warning bell. He drew the sword last. Its balance felt foreign, heavier than memory, yet it steadied his hand. Outside, the Greeks were breaking. A cry rose from the shallows where men fought knee-deep in water, and another answered from the ships themselves as Trojans set torches to the nearest hulls. Patroclus walked through the thinning smoke, the armor catching light and drawing every eye. At first no one spoke, then a voice from the lines shouted his name, and the shout became many. He raised the shield high so the sun flared across its face, and the men saw the device of Achilles blazing before them. "Stand with me," he called, voice carrying over the clash of bronze. "The man whose armor I wear still lives. While he breathes, so do we." The nearest ranks turned, shields locked again, spears leveled. The line that had been dissolving stiffened and pushed forward, the sudden surge carrying them past the first beached ships and into the Trojan press. For a moment the Trojans gave ground, startled by the sight of the familiar armor restored to the fight. Patroclus drove them back across the sand, each step measured and deliberate, the borrowed sword cutting arcs that left men stumbling. The tide turned in the space of a single charge. Greeks who had moments before thrown down their arms now reclaimed them, rallying to the figure they believed was Achilles returned. The Trojans who had been singing victory fell silent, their formation fracturing under the renewed assault. Patroclus pressed the advantage, leading from the front, the weight of the armor forcing him to move with a slower, more terrible purpose. Each blow he struck carried the memory of Achilles' strength, and the men behind him answered with their own renewed fury. The beach became a churning mass of locked shields and thrusting spears once more. Yet the gods watched, and one of them chose that hour to intervene. Apollo descended unseen, his hand light upon the shoulder of the man who wore another's armor. Patroclus felt the touch as a sudden coldness between the shoulder blades, a warning that the borrowed strength was already ebbing. He staggered once, recovered, and drove on, but the ranks around him began to thin. The Trojans, heartened by some unseen shift, closed again. Hector, still bloodied from the earlier rout, saw the figure in Achilles' armor and recognized the difference in the way it moved. Patroclus fought until the spear that found him struck true beneath the breastplate's edge. He fell to one knee, the great shield sliding from his arm, the helm tilting forward so that the world narrowed to a slit of sky and sand. The men who had followed him shouted his name in alarm, but the sound reached him as through deep water. Hector stepped forward, spear raised, and the last light of the day glinted along its shaft. The borrowed armor, now streaked with new blood, lay heavy on a body no longer able to bear it. The spear found its mark with a terrible finality, driving through the borrowed plates and into the chest beneath. Patroclus staggered once more, the world narrowing further until even the slit of sky vanished into darkness. Hector withdrew the weapon without haste, letting the body crumple at his feet amid the churned sand and scattered shields. A hush fell across the nearest ranks, broken only by the distant clash of bronze on bronze and the cries of men still locked in struggle. Hector stood over the fallen figure, his breath steady despite the weight of the moment. He bent to strip the gleaming armor, the same set that had turned so many heads on the field that morning. Blood streaked the breastplate where the spear had entered, and the helm rolled free to reveal the face of Patroclus, not the man Hector had expected. Surprise flickered across the Trojan's features, yet it hardened quickly into resolve. The armor belonged to Achilles by right, and now it would serve as proof of this day's work. The plain around them stretched red and broken, bodies strewn like driftwood after a storm. Greek and Trojan alike paused at the sight, shields lowering for the briefest span as the news rippled outward. Hector raised the spear high, its point still wet, and his voice carried across the lines. "This is the price of pride," he called, the words heavy with the dust of battle. Men on both sides answered with renewed shouts, the lull shattered as spears met once more. Far from the front, in the Greek encampment, Achilles received the first reports from runners who stumbled into his presence with torn cloaks and wild eyes. He stood at the entrance of his tent, the sea breeze tugging at his hair, and listened without interruption. The words landed like blows. Patroclus dead, the armor taken, Hector triumphant on the field. Achilles' hands clenched at his sides, the knuckles whitening against the darkening sky. Grief rose swift and fierce, tightening his throat until speech felt impossible. He turned inward, the tense shadows offering no comfort. The weight of loss pressed down, heavier than any shield he had ever borne. Patroclus had gone in his place, wearing the very armor meant to shield Achilles from this fate. Now the body lay exposed on the blood-soaked plain, and the thought carved deeper than any blade. Achilles sank to one knee, the ground cool beneath him, and let the silence stretch long enough for the distant roar of battle to fade into a single, ringing note of sorrow. The vow formed unbidden, sharp as the edge of a new-forged sword. "I will not rest until Hector falls," he said at last, the words low but carrying through the tent flaps to the men gathered outside. They shifted uneasily, sensing the change in their leader. Achilles rose, his gaze fixed on the horizon where smoke from funeral pyres already curled. The grief burned, yet it forged something harder in its place, a purpose that would not yield. He called for his own armor to be brought forth, the spare set untouched since the quarrel with Agamemnon, and the sound of hammered bronze echoed against the wooden posts. On the plain, Hector returned to the Trojan lines with the captured armor slung across his shoulders. Cheers rose around him, but he accepted them with the quiet of a man who knew the cost still to come. The day's light faded toward dusk, painting the field in hues of crimson and ash. Bodies cooled where they fell, and the living dragged their wounded toward campfires that would burn through the night. Hector paused at the edge of his own ranks, looking back once toward the spot where Patroclus had breathed his last. Achilles emerged from his tent as the first stars pricked the sky. He moved with purpose now, the earlier stillness replaced by a stride that cut through the gathering crowd. His men fell silent at the sight of him, the grief in his eyes matched by the set of his jaw. The vow had taken root, and with it came the promise of blood yet to spill. The plain waited, red and unforgiving, and Achilles turned his face toward it, the sea at his back, and the future narrowing to a single, unyielding line. Achilles moved across the plain with purpose, each stride carrying him closer to the massive gates of Troy, where dust still lingered from the morning's retreat. The walls rose before him like an unyielding judgment, their stones scarred by years of siege and fire. He scanned the battlements for any sign of movement, his breath steady, even as rage coiled tighter in his chest. The city seemed to hold its own silence, broken only by the distant cries of sentries who had already marked his approach. Hector appeared at last, slipping through a side gate with his shield raised and spear in hand. He had not fled far. Achilles gave chase at once, his feet pounding the earth as he followed the Trojan prince along the outer circuit of the walls. The path curved sharply, forcing both men into a relentless circuit that tested every step. Hector's armor clanged with each turn, yet he kept just ahead, using the stone barriers to shield himself from a direct throw. The sun beat down without mercy, turning the ground to powder beneath their boots. Around the first bend they ran, then the second, the walls towering on one side and the open plain stretching on the other. Achilles closed the distance by inches, his spear arm cocked and ready, but Hector ducked behind a jutting tower and doubled back toward the gates. The chase became a dance of pursuit and evasion, each man measuring the other's strength without committing to the final clash. Sweat streaked Hector's face when he glanced back, his eyes wide with the knowledge that this circle could not last forever. The third circuit brought them nearer the main gates once more. Achilles pressed harder now, driving Hector into the open stretch where no wall could intervene. "Stand and face me, son of Priam." The shout cracked across the air like thunder, carrying the full weight of grief and vengeance. Hector slowed, then turned, planting his feet in the dust as if the earth itself might anchor him. For a heartbeat, the two warriors regarded each other, shields raised, the wind carrying the faint sounds of Troy's defenders watching from above. Hector lunged first, his spear thrusting toward Achilles' side in a desperate bid to end the hunt. Achilles deflected the blow with his shield and countered with a sweep that forced Hector backward toward the gate itself. The clash of bronze rang out again and again, each strike heavier than the last. Dust rose in clouds around them, turning their figures into shadows locked in fury. Hector fought with the courage of a man defending his home, yet every parry cost him ground. Achilles felt the storm inside him rise, grief sharpening into something colder and more absolute. They circled once more beneath the shadow of the gates. Hector's shield arm trembled from the strain, his breathing ragged, yet he refused to yield the space. Achilles saw the opening and took it, driving forward with a ferocity that left no room for mercy. The spear struck true, piercing armor and flesh in one unstoppable motion. Hector staggered, his knees buckling as the fatal blow found its mark. He sank against the gate, fingers clutching at the shaft, the light in his eyes dimming even as the city walls stood silent witness to the end. Achilles stood over him, chest heaving, the spear still in his grip. The fury that had carried him through the chase settled into a heavy quiet, broken only by the faint echo of his own heartbeat. The plain stretched away behind him, red and unforgiving as ever, while the gates of Troy remained closed and unmoved. Achilles stood over him, chest heaving, the spear still in his grip. The fury that had carried him through the chase settled into a heavy quiet, broken only by the faint echo of his own heartbeat. The plain stretched away behind him, red and unforgiving as ever, while the gates of Troy remained closed and unmoved. Night crept across the battlefield like a thief. Achilles dragged the body by its heels, the dust rising in thin clouds that clung to his arms. He reached his tent and left the corpse there in the open, its face turned toward the stars. No one spoke. The Myrmidons kept their distance, their eyes lowered. Priam came at last. He moved alone through the shadows, an old man wrapped in a simple cloak, leading a wagon piled with gold and fine cloth. His steps faltered only once, when the first torchlight caught the outline of Achilles' camp. Then he straightened and walked on. Achilles saw him from the fire. The king of Troy sank to both knees without ceremony. The gold rattled faintly in its chests. Priam bowed his head until his forehead touched the ground. "I come for my son," he said. The words were quiet, yet they filled the space between them. Achilles did not answer at once. He studied the bent figure, the white hair, the hands that had once held scepters now pressed flat against the dirt. A long silence stretched. The fire popped. Somewhere a horse shifted its weight, and the harness creaked. Priam lifted his face. Tears had carved clean lines through the dust on his cheeks. "I kiss the hand that killed my boy," he said. He reached out and touched Achilles' fingers, rough with dried blood. Achilles felt the tremor in those old knuckles. For the first time since Patroclus fell, the rage inside him wavered. He remembered his own father, far away in Phthia, waiting for a son who might never return. The thought pressed against his ribs like a blade. "Rise," Achilles said at last. His voice was low. Priam obeyed, though his knees shook. They stood eye to eye, king and warrior, while the wagon waited behind them. Achilles named the ransom without counting it. The number was enough. It was more than enough. They agreed the truce would last 11 days, time to wash the body, to mourn, to lay Hector in the earth. No spear would fly between the walls and the ships until the rites were finished. The words left both men hollow. Achilles turned away first. He ordered the body prepared and wrapped in fresh linen. When he looked back, Priam was already climbing onto the wagon seat, shoulders bowed under the weight of what he carried home. The wheels turned slowly over the ruts. The sound faded into the dark. Achilles remained by the fire until the last echo died. The truce held for now, thin as breath on cold air.